Welcome back to the Ruddy Brew. My name is T. Edge, and today we're talking Christianity and the black people in European lands and beyond, prior to what we were made to believe was a 1619 transatlantic slave trade. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my newest subscribers for showing support. And I know it's been a long time since I've dropped a video, but I know you all understand the importance of accurate information. I also prefer to get it right or correct the first time instead of maintaining the false narratives that have been circulating within the past 200 years, especially about who we are. If you are new here, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe, but just wait until after you've heard the presentation. It's just that after you've heard the presentation, don't forget to flip your phone to the side and click the watermark in the corner down here. With that being said, I know that at some point I will be bringing up Christians and Jews, or maybe even Muslims. So as a disclaimer, I'd like to say that I don't condone any racist or superiority ideologies. All individuals are created equal. Also, every man and woman is entitled to practice the religion of his or her choosing, and they shouldn't be discriminated against based upon their religious preferences. Along with that, if at any time you feel that you can debunk or disprove any of the information that I present in this video or any other video, please feel free to do so. The only thing I ask is that you attack the information and not myself, the presenter. But you know I want to talk about it, so let's go. Now, we've discussed in part one who the Ashkenazi Jews are and their relationship to the original race of Jews of Europe and how they transitioned into the position of prominence, the prominence that they hold in the West. That brings us to the role that Christianity actually played in all of this. But I beg of you, please, before you tune me out, just hear me out. I know that there are some people who are going to be offended when I begin talking about Christianity, but I need for you just to breathe for a minute. I need for people to understand that Christianity and Christ are not interchangeable words. Neither do they always support one another. All of us understand, or at least we should understand, that Christianity prior to America was Roman Catholicism. In many respects, Christianity is still referring to Catholicism. Our society is considered Western society, right? When news anchors speak about America, they commonly refer to us as the West, correct? You see, this is because America is an extension of Western Europe. And the religion of Western Europe, even today in 2024, is Roman Catholicism. Before there was an African Methodist, Episcopal, or Black Baptist Association, or Pentecostal church, there was the movement known as Protestantism. And Protestantism ushered in all of these different denominations that we see today. Just think about it. Those that reformed the faith were protesting certain practices within Roman Catholicism. Prior to America, Christianity and Catholicism were synonymous terms. Christian did mean Catholic, and Catholic meant Christian. The sooner we accept that truth, the sooner we will be able to stop fighting about church history and dogma. Today, we think that Catholicism is a denomination, but in reality, it's the OG faith from the 4th century. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that no one should ever be Catholic or Roman Catholic ever again. Again, everybody gets to practice their religion. I'm just untangling a little truth. Because not even the reformers said to stop being Catholic. They only preached against some of the Catholic doctrines. And in some respects, they formed their own. I said all of that to show that Christian and Christ are not synonyms. But instead of getting into Protestants and Protestantism, let's deal with the chokehold that the Catholic and Roman Church had over all of Europe, particularly in respect to the Jews and the Mohammedans, or the Muslims. And yes, the Muslims did in fact take over Spain, and they attempted to conquer France, but they lived all throughout Europe, and they were known as Moors or Ishmaelites. Now, I know, being a member of the black community, that we've been taught that we are, or we were, the Moors in Europe. As a community, though, we're not. I mean, some of us did proselyte into the religion of the Moors or Ishmaelites, which is known today as Muslim. And again, just to reiterate, I'm not denying anyone the right to practice the religion of their choosing. But in Europe, you had Jews converting Christians and Muslims. You had Muslims converting Christians and Jews. But most important, especially for this segment, you had Christians converting Jews and Muslims, mostly by force. Now, I've noted in a few of my past videos that in 1492, the Jews and Moors were exiled from Spain and Portugal in 1495. But this expulsion edict was for the Jews who would not be baptized. Right off the bat, let's go into one of our sources. In the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic of Spain, by William H. Prescott, published in 1854, beginning on the last paragraph of page 262, it reads, "The edict for the expulsion of the Jews was signed by the Spanish sovereigns at Granada, March 30th, 1492. The preamble alleges, in vindication of the measure, the danger of allowing further intercourse between the Jews and their Christian subjects, in consequence of the incorrigible obstinacy with which the former persisted in their attempts to make converts of the latter to their own faith and to instruct them in their heretical rites, in open defiance of every legal prohibition and penalty." If we move over to page 263, it finally decrees that all unbaptized Jews of whatever sex, age, or condition should depart from the realm by the end of July next ensuing, prohibiting them from revisiting it on any pretext whatsoever, under penalty of death and confiscation of property. It was moreover interdicted to every subject to arbor, succor, or minister to the necessities of any Jew, after the expiration of the term limited for his departure. The persons and property of the Jews in the meantime were taken under the royal protection. They were allowed to dispose of their effects of every kind on their own account, and to carry the proceeds along with them in bills of exchange or merchandise, not prohibited, but neither in gold nor silver. Now, those mentions are a bit vague because Europe at the time had been persecuting under the pretense of protecting the faith for years, as noted in the first part of the video. The expulsion from Spain and Portugal led them to escape to other European countries where they met more persecution, death, and expulsion, which led to even more persecution, death, and expulsion. But here's the clincher. The persecution wasn't just for all the Jews as I originally suspected. The persecution and torture was for the Jews who had converted to Christianity but maintained their Hebrew or Jewish customs, which are included in pages 236 and 237 of the history of the Jews from the war with Rome to the present time. And to begin reading on page 236, it says, 3 inquisitors were appointed, Torquemada, Juglar, and de Avila. And their first act was to put forth an edict in which they declared to be the duty of all faithful Christians, without paying any regard to rank or condition, to accuse to the tribunal any whom they knew to be open professors but secret enemies of Christ. Any who did not do so became themselves amenable to the law for their criminal silence. To facilitate such accusations, a manifesto was issued in which various proofs were mentioned by which a secret Jew might be detected. We learned from it that a man might be accounted as a concealed Jew if, among many similar evidences, he 1. Put on clean clothes, or had clean tablecloth on the Saturday, or dispensed with the fire on the Friday night. 2. If he washed the blood from meat or examined the knife before slaying an animal. 3. If on the Day of Atonement he asked forgiveness of those whom he had offended, or put his hands on his children's heads to bless them without making the sign of the cross. 4. If he gave his children Jewish names. 5. If he ate the same meat as Jews or sat down to table with them. If, when dying, he turned his face to the wall or let anyone else turn it. If he washed a corpse with warm water. If he spoke approvingly of the dead, such person being a Jew, or made lamentation for him, or caused a body to be buried in virgin soil, etc. But that's not the only place that any such list is found. Here's another list. Returning to the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabel the Catholic, etc. Beginning on page 251. The presumptive proofs by which the charge of Judaism was established against the accused are so curious that a few of them may deserve notice. It was considered good evidence of the fact if the prisoner wore better clothes or cleaner linen on the Jewish Sabbath than other days of the week, if he had no fire in his house the preceding evening, if he sat at a table with Jews or ate the meat of animals slaughtered by their hands, or drank a certain beverage held in much estimation by them, if he washed a corpse in warm water, or when dying turned his face to the wall, or, finally, if he gave Hebrew names to his children, a provision most whimsically cruel since, by a law of Henry II, he was prohibited under severe penalties from giving them Christian names. He must have found it difficult to extricate himself from the horns of this dilemma. Such are a few of the circumstances, some of them purely accidental in their nature, others the result of early habit, which might well have continued after a sincere conversion to Christianity, and all of them trivial, on which capital accusations were to be alleged, and even satisfactorily established. The inquisitors, adopting the wildly torturous policy of the ancient tribunal, proceeded with the dispatch, which shows that they could have paid little difference even to the affectation of legal form. On the 6th day of January, 6 convicts suffered at the stake. 17 more were executed in March, and still a greater number of them in the month following. And by the 4th of November in the same year, no less than 298 individuals had been sacrificed in the auto-da-fe of Seville. There's one more source with another list that I want to go over real quick. In the book, The Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition, beginning on page 37. It is interesting to know what were considered as proofs of a relapse into Judaism. 37 articles were drawn out, and the mention of a few of them is sufficient to prove how frivolous and absurd were the grounds which sufficed to deprive multitudes of unfortunate fellow creatures of happiness, property, and life. It was to be investigated whether an individual had made a difference between Saturday and other days by laying a white cloth on the table, or putting on a clean shirt or better clothes than other days, whether he had cut the throat of a fowl and killing it for food, or had withdrawn the sinew from an animal destroyed for the same purpose, whether he had eaten meat during Lent or on the fast prescribed by the church, or had abstained from food on the Jewish Day of Atonement or other Hebrew fasts, or used baths, cut his hair, or pared his nails on days preceding such fasts, or had he eaten unleavened bread, or used certain herbs in Passover, or procured green branches, or made presents of fruit to friends at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or drunk kasher wine that prepared for Jewish ceremonials, or eaten meat killed by Jews, or repeated certain Jewish blessings on particular occasions, or recited the Psalms of David without concluding with the words, "Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost." Whether any parent had given Hebrew names to his children, or washed or shaved the head of a child on the part which the chrism of baptism had been poured, or invited his friends and relations to dine before leaving on a long journey, or whether a dying man had turned his face to the wall, or had it so turned by others, or a dead body had been washed in warm water, or the water had been emptied out of all vessels in the house of a deceased person, together with a long catalogue of similar inquiries. Such were among the proofs of relapse from the newly adopted faith into the errors of the old superstition. Sad indeed was the fate of those of whom it could be pretended that they cooked their stews in oil instead of lard. And many old Christians in after times had to repent that their casual dislike to pork or shellfish had brought them under the suspicion of being secret votaries of what it pleased the inquisitors to designate as the impious law of Moses. So you see, the new Christians, as they would be called in English today, were those who were allowed to stay in European countries. If they were ever suspected of so much as sharing a meal with someone who would not convert to Catholicism, they could be arrested and taken to trial for the Inquisition, and potentially taken to the most extreme level of being burned at the stake before the public. That means if an adult child had converted but went to have dinner with their parents, or vice versa, if parents had converted and visited their adult children and they ate a meal that could be considered Jewish, then they could be arrested and jailed by the Inquisition. This information is critical to our understanding of the ethnic Jews, because these ethnic Jews were those who would become prisoners, shipped to various locations throughout the world as slaves for perpetuity. Even as slaves in Spain, they could not stay in the country. In the book A History of the Inquisition of Spain by Henry Charles Lee, Volume 1, printed in 1906, we begin reading, in August 1492, 9 caravels arrived there, loaded with Jews and infected with pestilence, which they communicated to the city, whence it spread through the kingdom and raged for a year, causing a mortality of 20,000. Then, in the confusion following the invasion of Charles VIII in 1495, the people rose against them. Many abandoned their religion to escape slaughter or slavery. Many were carried off to distant lands and sold as slaves. This tribulation lasted for 3 years, during which those who were steadfast in the faith were imprisoned or burnt or exposed to the caprices of the mob. Turkey, on the whole, proved the most satisfactory refuge where Bajazet found them such profitable subjects that he ridiculed the wisdom popularly ascribed to the Spanish sovereigns who would commit such great an act of folly. Though exposed to occasional persecution, they continued to flourish. Most of the existing Jews of Turkey and Europe, and a large portion of those in Turkey and Asia, are descendants of the exiles. They absorbed their older communities, and their language is still the Spanish of the 16th century. When the fate of the exiles was, for the most part, so unendurable, it was natural that many should seek to return to their native land, and as we have seen from Bernaldez, large numbers did so. At first, this was tacitly permitted, on condition of conversion, provided they brought money with them. But the sovereigns finally grew fearful that the purity of the faith would be impaired, and in 1499, an explanatory edict was issued, decreeing death and confiscation for any Jew entering Spain, whether a foreigner or returning exile, even if he asked for baptism, unless beforehand he sent word that he wished to come for that purpose. When he was to be baptized at the port of entry, and a notarial act was to be taken. That this savage edict was pitilessly enforced is manifested by several cases in 1500 and 1501. Moreover, all masters of Jewish slaves were ordered to send them out of the country within 2 months, unless they would submit to baptism. Spain was too holy a land to be polluted with the presence of a Jew, even in captivity. Bernaldez informs us that the Rabbi Meir wrote to Abraham Sr. that the sovereigns had banished 35,000 vassals, that is, 35,000 Jewish households. And he adds that of the 10 or 12 rabbis whom he baptized of their return, a very intelligent one named Zantolo of Victoria told him that there were in Castile more than 30,000 married Jews and 6,000 in the kingdoms of Aragon, making 160,000 souls when the edict was issued, which is probably as nearly correct an estimate as we can find. With time, the figures grew. Albertino, Inquisitor of Valencia, in 1534, quotes Reuchlin as computing the number of exiles at 420,000. The cautious Zarita quotes Bernaldez and adds that others put the total at 400,000, while Mariana tells us that most authors assert the total number of households to have been 170,000, and some put the total at 800,000 souls. Paramo quotes that the figure of 120,000 households, or over 600,000 souls. Isidore Loeb, after an exhaustive review of all authorities, Jewish and Christians, reaches the estimate of 235,000, 165,000 immigrants, 50,000 baptized, 20,000 died. And this is the view of the diminished number of Jews as shown by the Repartimiento of 1474 is probably too large an estimate. Some of these persecuted new Christians who felt that they could potentially be enslaved did in fact flee to distant lands. Many did flee to Turkey, and as we've read, they were still persecuted. But another location was Suriname in South America. In the earlier part of the century, considerable numbers of Jews sailed for the Brazils from the various ports of Holland under the leadership of 2 rabbins to found a Jewish colony. It throve and attained a considerable amount of prosperity until, in 1654, the Portuguese obtained possession of Brazil. Under these new masters, free exercise of their religion was not allowed the Jews. They therefore quitted the country, some returning to Holland, others settling in Sian or Suriname. Again, this text shows that they were free to practice their religion and still keep their customs in the Brazils until the Spanish took over with their slaving ways. And just as a side note, It probably wouldn't hurt to get your DNA results or the results of the older people in your family and see if you have some DNA that shows an autosomal match to Suriname or Guyana or French Guiana. I mean, it's pretty coincidental that we show DNA from this territory if we're just merely from the slave coast of Africa, right? I mean, it's just a question. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I have to thank Garfield Reed and Spooky Apologetics on the Berean TV channel for their attention given to the subject that kept the importance of Amsterdam, Italy, and Turkey, and Poland in the forefront of my mind while reading up on the history of the Jews. One thing that these books have done is preserve the gruesome nature of these Europeans when it came to their insane desire to annihilate the very existence of the Hebrews from the face of the earth, everywhere that they went. There was no safe haven in Amsterdam. There was no safe haven in Italy, no safe haven in Turkey, Russia, Poland, not even Germany. There was no safe haven anywhere the Jews went, not even Morocco or anywhere in Africa. Everywhere they went, they were despised. In some locations, there were kings and leaders that prevented the populace from piling up corpses. In most territories, they were not that lucky, though. This was from the 1200s to the 1600s. From the 1200s to the 1600s, they were more than likely to find a Jew in perpetual slavery to Christians with no opportunity to purchase their freedom. But in the 1600s, Holland became more tolerable, as outlined in the excerpt beginning on page 291. The Jews in Holland, the Costa Spinoza. The reader has already learned that towards the close of this last century, many of the Portuguese exiles found a refuge from persecution in Holland. In truth, of all the countries of Europe at this period of the history, none showed them such kindness as the Republic of the Low Country. If the Reformation had done the race of Israel no other service than that of opening to them this place of shelter, they would still have been largely indebted to it. No dream of the imagination could exceed the wretchedness of the Jews in Spain and Portugal at the outset of the 17th century. They had to choose between ruin, torture, and death on the one hand, not for themselves only, but for their wives and children also, or the surrender of their cherished faith, which was in their eyes the surrender of all hope here and hereafter. Their only escape from these stern alternatives lay in a lifelong duplicity and imposture which must needs degrade them in their own eyes to the very dust. So, in reading this, being that this was the 1600s, when slavery started in America, I decided that it would be a good idea to search for Jews in Holland or Amsterdam. And of course, it didn't net much. So instead, I did a search for slaves in Amsterdam, and this image came up. Now, you know how they do us. They show us the typical dark image that shows what are apparently, these dull-minded individuals, unsuspecting N-words. But when I find these pictures like this, I like to do slight photo color corrections, especially when I find obscured images of black people in slavery. And this picture came to life. These brothers, they don't look like they're dressed in slaves' garments. In fact, I did a further search of the cleaned up photo, and lo and behold, this image is a Rembrandt painting of two Negroes from the 1600s. And Rembrandt didn't move to Amsterdam until 1631. And upon further inspection, the clothing being worn by the brother, who kind of looks like Esther's husband Jethro, these clothes appear to be of some type of regal nature. I mean, why would these brothers, especially if they were slaves, get an opportunity to sit in the studio of one of the most prolific painters of their time? Where's the history of slaves in Amsterdam? I mean, New Amsterdam, what we know as New York, only began with about 11 slaves. Could those slaves have been new Christians who were found guilty of practicing their old Jewish customs? Maybe they named their children an Old Testament Bible name like Abraham, or maybe they were caught putting their hands on their children's head and blessing them without making the sign of the cross. You know, as I thought on this image, it kind of jogged my memory, and it reminded me of something else I read in the review of Jewish history. In this passage, it says the Jews dressed so regally that the Christians took offense. Then I remembered all the old pictures of Negros in regal attire. And let's just say, one thing about us, we stay putting it on, if you know what I mean. But now it makes sense why there were black parishes with coats of arms that depicted what we were told were Africans. Turns out they were most likely Hebrews or Jews that entire time. Now, what I did, I went to the web page of Rembrandt's old paintings. I didn't find the two Negros painting, but I found many images of Jewish scenes that appeared to depict European Jews, when all Europeans knew the Jews were a separate race from themselves. I mean, and we've read earlier that the German Jews didn't move into the area until the 1700s. And even if this is just some type of fantasy art, one thing that we know for sure is that according to this book, the Jews established their third synagogue in 1618 in Amsterdam. That's 1 year before the transatlantic slave trade that we were told about here in America. And remember, Rembrandt didn't move to Amsterdam until 1631. And regarding New Amsterdam or New York, according to the New York Historical Society, it was 1627 when the first slaves came to New Amsterdam, and many of the early slaves had Spanish or Portuguese names, and many have been Christian. And it also says that they spoke Portuguese. But to top things off, it was Holland where many of the Jews had escaped to find their way to the Brazils, as mentioned earlier. So is the European art that is now being displayed on the Rembrandt page being used to deceive the masses? It seems that slavery more and more has a correlation to the punishment of the Jews from Spain and Portugal, who found no relief running all over Europe. I mean, a part of me wants to even begin questioning if the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock were actually whites trying to find religious freedom. Maybe they were whites trying to find new Christians, because it seems that the black Portuguese were the people trying to escape persecution and find religious freedom, while the Christians followed after. Now, we found the Jews expelled from Spanish territories, fleeing north into France, Dutch and English territories. They were fleeing west into South America, Central America, or the Caribbean, and quite possibly North America. They were fleeing south into Africa. They were fleeing east into Central Europe and Turkey and Jerusalem and other Asian territories. Coincidentally, everywhere they escaped to, the Portuguese were the first to follow in most cases. This, I believe, is why some Negro families have unwritten lore of being in the land of the Americas as freemen and women and not slaves, being confused as Native Americans or Indians. And with that, we finally get to transition into the discussion on the transatlantic slave trade, because we've been made to believe that it was such a terrible coincidence that the Spanish, French, and British, as well as the Dutch nations, had congregated on the shores of Africa, bringing with them the torches of the Inquisition, the Roman Catholic missionaries, and a seemingly unsatiable bloodlust for individuals with dark brown skin. In part 3, we will be discussing the real transatlantic subjugation of an entire nation. As we get out of here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and is equally as important, share this video with everyone you can think of. If you feel I got anything wrong, if you feel I misread anything, please leave your comments in the comment box below. I can't wait to see you on part 3. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me here at the Ruddy Brew. And remember, nothing is ever what you thought it was. Peace.